let's go ahead and get started. So next slide, please. So construction began on the SS Central. I'm so sorry. Is anybody else getting an echo?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, much better. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so construction began on the SS Central America in October of 1852 at Morgan Iron Works under the supervision of William H. Webb. So Webb's design called for an 85-meter length ship, 2 inclined oscillating cylinder steam engines, also known as wobblers in the U.S., and 3 decks to accommodate more passengers. So although it's often portrayed, like in this illustration, as having 2 smokestacks, it only actually had 1. And the ship officially entered service on October 20th, 1853. Next slide, please.
Get your shit together.
So the ship was originally named the SS George Law for the American financier who, along with Marshall Roberts and Bose McElvain, established the U.S. Mail Steamship Company. So the company formed in 1848 when they were awarded a contract from the U.S. government to carry U.S. mails from New York City to Panama along its delivery route bound for California. So the typical round-trip journey began in the port of New York and then to Aspinwall, Panama, which is Cologne today. And after a short layover in Havana, the ship would return to New York. So the trip took roughly 20 days and consumed about 1,200 tons of coal. So damage to the hulls of wooden ships from wood-boring bivalves that were native to the Caribbean waters were very common. So in response to this, the ship would undergo routine ship repairs. So repairs done in June and July of 1857 included a recoppering of the hull and an overhaul of the engines and the boilers. And it was at this time that the ship was renamed the SS Central America. Next slide, please. So during its 5 years in service, the SS Central America completed 43 successful trips, carried over 13,000 passengers, and helped transport over $54 million worth of gold from California to Washington, D.C. So the ship had 7 different commanding officers, with Commander William Lewis Herndon of the United States Navy leading 19 of those voyages. So multiple survivor accounts tell that while the ship was sinking, Commander Herndon stood atop the ship's side wheel as he directed his men to evacuate the passengers. And like a true sea captain, Commander Herndon went down with his ship. And his heroic death deeply moved the country, and a statue, the Herndon Monument, was erected at the U.S. Naval Academy in his honor. Next slide, please. So the final voyage of the SS Central America has been well documented, both academically and among treasure seekers. So on August 20th, 1857, as passengers in a shipment of gold bound for Washington, D.C. boarded the SS Sonoran in San Francisco Bay, the SS Central America left the port of New York and headed to Panama. The ship left Aspinwall, Panama on September 3rd, 1857, with 476 passengers and a shipment of gold valued at over $1.2 million in the currency of that time. So after staying the night in Havana, the ship was last seen departing at 9:30 a.m. on September 8th, 1857. So the following day, a tropical storm began to develop over the Atlantic Ocean, which eventually turned into a Category 2 hurricane. So the image here is showing Hurricane Hugo from 1989. So this storm was roughly the same size and followed about the same path as the hurricane from 1857. So the SS Central America floundered in hurricane conditions for 2 days, springing multiple leaks as the hull was twisted by the waves, and it quickly became apparent that the storm wouldn't let up when the boiler fires were extinguished from the rising waters. And so the male passengers were ordered by Commander Herndon to assist in the bailing. So crew and passengers bailed the water for over 30 hours. And by the 3rd day of the conditions, the boiler room flooded and the engine fires were completely extinguished. So multiple testimonies from survivors recalled that everyone had moved to one side of the ship and they knew something was wrong when the lantern stopped swaying because of the wave action. Next slide, please. So luckily, by midday on September 12th, 1857, a passing brig, the Marine, noticed the sinking ship and pulled up as close as the storm would allow. So Commander Herndon immediately ordered the evacuation of the women and children. So the large violent waves actually destroyed 2 of the 5 lifeboats, and passengers literally had to be lowered down to the ships or to the boats with ropes tied around their waists, as you can see in the image here. So all of the women and almost all of the children were rescued. The only child lost was thought to have stayed with his older brother, who was still on the ship. So due to the intensity of the waves, the time it took the lifeboats to get to the Marine it started to drift farther and farther away. So this made return trips very slow and very exhausting for the men who were rowing the boats. So as the last lifeboat was leaving, Commander Herndon fired a rocket into the night sky, signaling the imminent loss of the ship. And by the night of September 12th, the SS Central America sat at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Survivors recalled the scene of hundreds of men being tossed around by the violent waves, holding onto anything to stay adrift and screaming for somebody to save them. Well, thanks to a persistent bird, the captain of the Norwegian bark Ellen altered his course and found himself suddenly in the middle of a shipwreck debris field. So the ship arrived about 5 hours after the initial sinking, and the crew was able to find 50 survivors. And against all odds, 9 days after the sinking, 3 more men were rescued adrift and miles away from the sinking. So in total, 425 men lost their lives. And if the shock at the loss of life wasn't enough, major banks that were counting on the gold payments from California had to file for bankruptcy. So the loss of that $1.2 million shipment of gold was the final instigator in the financial panic of 1857. So the shipment included ingots and freshly minted $20 gold eagles that were ready for circulation. So the loss of the shipment made that year and type of coin highly desirable for coin collectors today. And the thought of discovering the treasure that was in the shipwreck has fueled treasure hunters for generations. Next slide, please. So the shipwreck site was finally discovered in 1986 by the Columbus American Discovery Group. So with a team of salvage experts and scientists, the Columbus Group recovered materials in the wreck during a series of expeditions from 1986 to 1991. So the wreck was discovered using historical data combined with search theory and composite probability maps to identify anomalies along the seafloor. And then sonar was used to flag those anomalies. So one of the areas that the team selected to look at was the Blake Bahama Outer Ridge. So Blake Ridge sits about 2,200 meters below the ocean surface. It's a 500-kilometer long, 8.5-kilometer thick dune-like feature that sits on a continental slope about 250 kilometers from the coast of South Carolina. Next slide, please. So after a few months at sea, researchers were conducting their routine dives with their submersible vehicle. And during one of the dives, this video screen was suddenly filled with one of the most distinguishing features of the SS Central America, a giant steel sidewheel. Now, although substantial, this wasn't conclusive that they had found the right ship. So it took several more dives and surveys of the area to discover the biggest piece of supporting evidence, the ship's bell. So as the submersible lifted it up out of the mud, researchers could clearly make out the lettering on their video screens. Morgan Iron Works, New York, 1853. The researchers continued to survey the site, well aware that the need to return to shore for the winter season was growing. And days before they were due to return to the mainland, crew members were examining the photo negatives and noticed some colorful anomalies. So because of the precision of each dive, the exact location the photos were taken from was known. So within hours, the team sent their submersible back down. And as the sediment settled and the video screens adjusted to the light, the screens, which for months had been filled with colorless ocean floor, were filled with, next slide, please, gold. So the photo on the left here is showing the stacks of the ingots surrounded by the decaying ship timbers. So these were the first traces of the gold shipment that they found. And a little farther away, as shown in the image on the right here, the team found stacks of coins exactly as they were packed into their pine wood boxes for transport. Next slide, please. So all of the team's hard work had paid off. They found one of the greatest lost treasures of the 1800s. But unfortunately, their success would also come with a healthy dose of controversy. And the Discovery Group would be no more, and the treasure had a new owner. Next slide, please. So in the 1990s, Dwight Manley purchased the Columbus American Discovery Group and its assets. So Bob Evans, the chief scientist studying the treasure, was offered a position and decided to stay with the treasure he was partially responsible for finding. And in 2014, Bob went on another 5-month expedition to Blake Ridge, and about 31,000 coins were recovered. Next slide, please. So the 2014 expedition focused on the debris field that was surrounding the ship. And the debris field covered about 10 acres. So newer and updated technologies allowed for the collection of more data in 2 weeks than the whole original excavation season. Next slide, please. So while surveying the debris field, the team came upon the ship's purser safe. So after sitting on the ocean floor for over 150 years, it was still intact. And when the team attempted to move it, next slide, please, the door fell off. And so they did an initial examination of the contents, and it showed what kind of looked like a lockbox. Next slide, please. But once they got it out, they quickly realized it was actually a saddlebag. Next slide, please. So the safe was also found to contain a vest that was rolled up in a bundle and tied off with twine. So later examination revealed that it had 4 hidden pockets, and in each pocket it had, next slide, please, pokes that held genuine California Gold Rush placer gold. So in the summer of 2018, I had the privilege of meeting Bob Evans. So my advisor, Dr. Melchior, and my fellow wizard in training, Brian Seymour, and myself all traveled to his lab to witness the opening of one of these pokes. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we have a short video showing the actual opening of the poke.
Well, there's a lot of red.
No, it's rusty.
So everything that you're seeing here is gold. It's all placer gold. That red tint that you see on everything is due to the breakdown of the ironworks from the ship. So they essentially kind of stained everything that was left behind.
There's one that's vastly different there.
There's a big rock.
Look, he's like shiny fast.
This was probably one of the
That shiny
coolest
piece
days
like that, over
of
about
my
6.5
entire life.
feet long.
We were seeing this gold that hadn't been seen
here?
since the
No, you
person
just
put it
touched
in
it.
the
You
bag.
just touched it.
Right
there.
Yeah, that one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, just got a whole big glob to fold in.
Look at, there's a big, it's gonna come out the hole.
Oh yeah,
Like a
there's
big-
some big chunks down here.
I told you it was round for a reason.
Yeah, that's a nugget.
Pull it out the hole.
Well, it went in this bag.
Yeah,
Should come
Bob,
out
but
of the-
OJ's gloves didn't fit after it got wet either.
Oh my god!
Holy.
Put that on the scale. I'm just curious.
Jeez, Bob.
This is like 3 ounces. Yep.
Exactly.
Called it.
Our biggest one yet.
90.
Next slide, please. So this is everything that was recovered from Poke 1 right here. So again, you can really see that kind of red rusty stain on everything. And just by a quick scan, we noticed that there were 2 species of gold. So we had the flatter, more rounded pieces and the angular, more crystalline pieces. Next slide, please. So we know that placer deposits are commonly mined along river valleys, as these deposits can be easily found and exploited with minimal equipment. So before the development and wide use of hydraulic mining, early miners used basic gravity separation techniques to extract that placer gold from the river deposits. So individual prospectors would work those high-grade areas or areas along the inside of bends and rivers where the gravity and water had naturally enriched the concentration of gold. So they used a small sluice called a rocker or a cradle in which they separated the gold from the river sediments. So these sluices would be set in those pre-dug grooves in the ground in such a way that the water would flow over it and remove the lighter material and leave behind the dense gold and the black sands. And that material caught in the grooves along the bottom of the sluice would then be transferred to a pan where the gold was further separated from the black sands. Next slide, please. So as more and more prospectors came and started to work the land, most of the more easily accessible deposits were quickly exhausted. So prospectors now had to find economical ways of extracting the vast amounts of those fine-grained golds from the river sediments. So the increase in the work needed to remove the gold led a lot of prospectors to form small companies of 10 to 15 workers. And with some pioneer ingenuity and elbow grease, the groups would completely dam up and divert rivers to allow easier access to the deposits that formed along the river bottom. So the increase in the waste material caused prospectors to abandon their pans and rockers for larger equipment that could process that more of that material faster. And in response to the increase in production, long toms were developed. Flumes were also constructed and acted as artificial waterways to bring that water to the areas where running water was not readily available. Next slide, please. So some more successful companies also began utilizing mercury amalgamation. So mercury would be put in the riffles of the sluices to absorb that fine gold. Now in this process, the liquid metal mercury melts the fine grained gold and forms a new liquid mercury gold alloy. And as the gold content of the mercury gold alloy would increase, it approached its room temperature freezing point and became stiff. So this frozen amalgam would then be collected and heated in a special type of still called a retort. And the heating would drive off the mercury and leave behind a spongy mass of gold. So by the 1960s, the costly nature of extracting this fine gold and the gradual depletion of the richer deposit eventually caused a lot of small companies to sell, which allowed larger companies to purchase the land surrounding their property. Next slide, please. So this brought us to the main motivating question behind my research. Who was the person that owned this vest? So to answer this, I had to start with where the gold was collected from. So what we did know was at this point in history, California's motherlode country was the only gold producing district in this part of the US. Also, all of the passengers aboard the ship came from California. So that information narrowed my study area to the Western Sierra Nevada foothills. Next slide, please. So one of the first things I looked at was the difference in the gold purity between the gold's cores and the gold's rims. So the only way to measure the true purity of the gold is to measure that composition of the core. So like most things exposed at the surface, gold will undergo various weathering processes. So these processes slowly break down the gold, removing those kind of impurities first. And as a result, a simple analysis of the surface of the gold would reveal a higher purity than what it actually is. So that's because of the removal of those impurities, or the elements that are less stable at the Earth's surface, will give the illusion of more gold atoms in the placer. So the core of the gold, which represents that original structure, is genuinely less pure than the weathered rims. So there's no gold that's 100% gold in nature. It's always going to have some percentage of silver and or copper in its structure, and possibly some other elements from the elemental soup that the gold precipitated out of. Some gold samples showed concentrations of certain elements in their rim analyses that weren't present in the cores. So this suggests that they were secondary deposits, most likely accumulated while it was traveling through a river system. Next slide, please. So there actually were quite a few samples from each poke that showed traces of mercury, particularly on the surface of the gold that was greater than 2 millimeters. The presence of the mercury on the surface but not in the core suggests that it was a secondary deposit from anthropogenic sources. So the presence of the finer grain gold from these pokes also indicated that mercury wasn't directly used in the recovery of the gold, but rather occurred due to local contamination by major mining companies. Next slide, please. So I also looked at the inclusions in the gold. So the inclusions are minerals that precipitated out of solution with the gold as it was forming. So analysis of these gives us insight into the conditions of the hydrothermal fluid that the gold formed from. So some inclusion minerals are ubiquitous and can be found anywhere, while others are limited to specific locations. So for example, on this slide here, I found some rare inclusions in Poke 2. So these are actually anglesite inclusions. So anglesite forms as the most common oxidation product of galena, which is a major ore of lead. Next slide, please. So the only deposits of anglesite associated with the gold in the Western Sierras are found in Plumas County, along the Upper Feather River, and in the Granite Basin Mining District and the Last Chance Mining District. Next slide, please. So I also looked at the accessory minerals found in the pokes, or the black sands. So these represent the other minerals that are part of the river system the gold was collected from. So even for a seasoned prospector, we all know it's inevitable you're going to end up with some black sand with your gold when you're processing it. So some of the minerals are very common, can be found anywhere. Others are less common. So one rare mineral that I did find from Poke 1 was I found some palladium crystals. Next slide, please. Now, the only placer deposits that had gold and palladium associated with each other were found in the North San Juan Mining District in Nevada County and in the Hamilton Mining District in Yuba County. Next slide, please. So the last thing that I looked at was the morphology of the gold, which is the shape. And so this can help us determine where in a river system the gold was actually collected from. So we know that native gold is very soft and therefore it's malleable. So it has a hardness of 2.5 on the Mohs hardness scale, which is the same hardness as our fingernails. So as that process of saltation is moving a gold down a river channel, the gold shape is altered. So we know that gold has a really high density. It's 19.32 grams per cubic centimeter. So if a fluvial system or a river system has enough energy to even pick up a gold nugget, then it's going to have a hard landing at the end of that jump. And each impact will like dent and change the shape of the gold. So we know that the rounded, more flat gold represents gold that's traveled farther along a river system, like the stuff on the left here. Or the more angular crystalline gold is going to have been collected closer to its source, like the stuff shown on the right here. Next slide, please. So we kind of narrowed down the two possible owners of the vest. So one of the options was a gold buyer. So we know that most gold buyers who worked in the California gold fields earned a living by serving kind of as a middleman between the miners who needed to stay at their sites and the assay offices that produced ingots in the larger towns. So they would often mix placer gold from different localities with known purities to produce mixtures with a purity that was advantageous to whatever special refining technique they needed. But these gold buyers didn't typically travel back east and are unlikely to have traveled with raw placer gold. Rather, they would have converted the gold into an assayer's ingot with a stamped value. That way they could readily deposit it in any bank in the country. Also, the particle sizes of the gold range so widely that it's unlikely that the East Coast gold buyer was responsible for transporting the vest. Gold buyers were often employed by jewelers looking for specific pieces that they could use to make specific jewelry. So for example, 2 complementary nuggets that would make earrings, or like one giant one for like a brooch or a necklace or something like that. It is possible that a gold buyer requested to have a special run without the use of mercury. However, it seems really unlikely because it would have caused the operation to essentially lose money. It's also possible that the gold buyer may have intended to sieve the gold upon arrival back at his office, but this also seems unlikely as it would have been transported in a more traditional manner and not hidden in the ship's purse or safe. Next slide, please. So it's highly likely that an individual prospector or a small partnership actually recovered the placer gold. The smaller operations couldn't afford the cost of mercury and are more willing to lose that flour gold during the recovery operation. And the presence of the black sands in the poke further suggested an individual that was transporting their private property, as they wouldn't have had to worry about refining it or cleaning up the gold in any specific way before they stored it. Next slide, please. So upon returning to Bob's lab for placer gold samples from Poke 2 and 3, it was actually discovered that a name was written along the side of Poke 2 here. So obviously this created a lot more questions than answers for me. So the 3 kind of main ideas we were throwing around about this was, number 1, this bag was recycled and was borrowed from a Darcy. Number 2, the Poke was meant to go to a Darcy upon the return to the port of New York. And 3, the Poke was sent on consignment absent its owner, Darcy. So I did some checks through some online genealogy databases looking for an L. Darcy, and information was pretty scarce. I did find one kind of possible match, but it was a bit of a stretch. But it was a young man that had immigrated from Liverpool, England to New York in the 1840s, and he would have been in his early 30s at the time of the sinking of the ship. Next slide, please. However, my advisor found a census record from 1860 that revealed a 24-year-old Irish-born J. Darcy who lived in Upper Indian Creek, Del Norte, California, which is near the Klamath Mountains. It's possible that young Mr. Darcy, or a relative of, worked for a gold buyer, and Poke 2 was the gold he had collected for his employer. Again, while this isn't conclusive proof of ownership, it's a possibility that this Poke once belonged to an individual or a relative of who was actually L. Darcy. Or was shipping to that relative back east. Looking forward to doing some future work and solving this mystery. Next slide, please. So the conclusion of my research, I pretty much determined that Poke 1 came from the Yuba River. Those palladium crystals were a big indicator of that. We also had a lot of mercury deposits on the surface of the gold, and we know there were a lot of major operations along the Yuba River. From Poke 2, we determined it was most likely from the upper Feather River, and those anglesite inclusions were a big indicator for that. Further research, looking forward to finding out more about L. Darcy. And then unfortunately, due to COVID, I wasn't able to do much more research on Poke 3, but we did find that there were a lot of inclusions. So excited for future work to be able to see what's happening there. And finally, we determined that most likely the owner of the vest was an individual prospector that was traveling back east with his personal treasure that he found, mainly because we still had those black sands and it was hidden in a vest, hidden in a safe rather than in his luggage. Next slide. Oh, thank you very much.